imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that the dictionary, the literal rule book of reality that we use, was just silently rewritten while you slept?
Right, like the baseline code we use to communicate is just suddenly different.
Exactly. Words you thought you understood suddenly mean something entirely different. And, without even realizing it, the language you use every single day has suddenly made you guilty of an offense you didn't even know you committed.
It's a pretty terrifying concept to wake up to.
It really is. So, welcome back to the deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us again today.
Absolutely.
But before we even get started, do us a massive favor. Please hit that like and subscribe button wherever you're listening right now. It really, really helps us keep bringing you these extensive breakdowns.
Yeah, it's honestly the best way to ensure we can keep doing this kind of, deep analytical work for you.
Exactly. And today's deep dive requires some serious analytical work. I mean, we are doing a massive, comprehensive review of a newly published ebook that is, well, it's making some serious waves out there.
Oh, massive waves.
You can actually check out the book for yourself right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. It's called End of Gynocentrism, and it's a 2026 manifesto written by Conrad Riker.
And right in the preface, the author is incredibly explicit about his target audience. He says he's writing specifically for the native Anglosphere man.
Right, and it offers this really sweeping, highly provocative, and just completely unapologetic critique of modern Western civilization, feminism, and basically entire architecture of our current institutions.
It's an incredibly dense text, too. Riker isn't just throwing out basic cultural complaints.
No, not at all.
He really attempts to trace what he views as this systemic disenfranchisement of men across a multitude of disciplines. We're talking linguistics, epistemology, economics, behavioral psychology, and even ancient mythology.
Which is wild. But, okay, before we jump in, we need to be very, very clear with you. This source material contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
As your guides today, we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the ideologies presented in this text.
Right. Our mission today is strictly to impartially report on the content provided.
Exactly. We're just here to help you, the listener, understand the arguments and the ideas contained in the original source material. We're here to analyze the text, not advocate for it.
That is the crucial framing for today. Our job is to just map out the architecture of Riker's argument, show you how he builds his case brick by brick so you can evaluate the structure for yourself.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is to trace Riker's core argument from its absolute foundation. We're going to start exactly where he starts, which is this claim that our language has been intentionally and systematically manipulated.
And from there, we'll explore how he connects that linguistic shift to a complete overhaul of how society determines what is true.
Right, essentially a shift from logic to emotion. Then we'll look at the fiscal and the institutional consequences he claims resulted from all of that.
And finally, we'll lay out his proposed solution, which he calls the logocentric restoration.
Which is basically this complete, technologically insulated withdrawal from modern society. So, to truly grasp the scope of Riker's worldview, you really have to look at where he believes this cultural war actually started.
Yeah, and he doesn't point to a specific political election or, a protest or a piece of legislation. He points directly at the dictionary.
He calls the people responsible for this the word horde raiders, which is quite a title.
It is. And his premise is pretty stark. He says whoever controls the dictionary controls the battlefield.
Right, and the mechanism here is profound if you actually think about it. He argues that over the last decade, there's been this silent, highly coordinated campaign of lexical revisionism.
And he isn't talking about the natural evolution of slang, like how kids change up words?
No, not at all. The book cites a very specific claim that back in 2018, the Oxford English Dictionary silently altered over 10,000 gendered entries.
10,000. And the core of his argument is that this happened completely out of public view. There was no democratic vote, no parliamentary debate, no public consensus.
It was just a quiet institutional rewriting of reality. And he emphasizes that this wasn't an effort to make language more precise or clear. He views it as the outright weaponization of language.
Yeah, he claims that fundamental concepts, words that form the basis of our legal and social contracts, have been completely redefined to serve a very specific ideological agenda.
Let's look at some of the examples he highlights. Take the word racism.
Right. Riker argues the definition was changed from meaning an objective discriminatory action taken by an individual based on race to representing basically any societal statistical outcome that happens to be disparate by race.
Regardless of individual intent.
Exactly, regardless of intent.
He also points to the words violence and harm, right?
He does. He claims violence was historically understood as physical force intended to hurt or damage someone. But he notes it's been semantically expanded to encompass uncomfortable speech or differing political opinions.
Which is a massive shift.
Huge.
Yeah.
And similarly, he argues harm was redefined from objective bodily injury or material loss to purely subjective emotional offense.
The text gets incredibly specific with its examples here too, pulling directly from major dictionary updates. Like, he points out that in 2020, Merriam-Webster added a secondary definition to the word female.
Yeah, and they defined it based entirely on gender identity, essentially saying female means having a gender identity that is the opposite of male.
And then he notes that in 2022, the Cambridge Dictionary quietly redefined the word woman to include an adult who lives and identifies as a woman.
This is where Riker applies formal logic to critique the shift. He presents a classic logical syllogism to argue that this redefinition is basically epistemological arson.
Epistemological arson, wow.
Yeah, his logic goes like this. If a woman is defined as anyone who identifies as a woman, and the act of identification inherently requires knowing what the thing you are identifying as actually is,
Right.
but that thing no longer has an objective biological anchor, then the definition is entirely circular.
It just refers only to itself.
Exactly. He argues it's a semantic void that destroys the ability to communicate objective reality.
He also brings up the cognitive scientist Steven Pinker's concept of the euphemism treadmill.
Which is a great concept.
It is. For you listening, if you aren't familiar with that term, Pinker originally used it to describe how society constantly invents new, polite words to replace offensive ones.
But eventually, the new words just absorb the exact same stigma as the old ones.
Right. The classic example is how crippled became handicapped, which became disabled, which became differently abled. The word changes, but the underlying human perception doesn't.
But Riker takes Pinker's linguistic observation
Yeah.
and applies this very dark interpretation to it. He argues that modern ideological activists looked at the euphemism treadmill and realized it was a weapon.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if you can force people to constantly change their vocabulary, like if the correct term changes every 6 months, you keep the general population perpetually off balance.
It's like playing a board game where your opponent is secretly rewriting the rule book under the table. So no matter what move you make, you're penalized.
That is a perfect analogy. Riker's claim is that people are kept just one wrong syllable away from social or professional destruction.
And the text argues that the true goal of this constant linguistic shifting isn't clarity, and it certainly isn't politeness. The goal is pure confusion, because confusion breeds compliance.
Right. It's a mechanism of control.
He illustrates this with this amazing historical artifact, actually. He digs up a 1985 piece written by the cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter.
The satire piece.
Yeah, it's a satire called A Person Paper on Purity in Language. Hofstadter was trying to satirize the push for gender-neutral language by inverting it to an absolutely absurd degree, targeting race instead of gender.
He suggested that instead of saying chairman, we should say white chair. Or instead of freshman, we should say fresh white.
Which is obviously ridiculous. Hofstadter intended it as a strict reductio ad absurdum, a philosophical technique where you take your opponent's idea to its absolute, most extreme logical conclusion to demonstrate how ridiculous the underlying premise is.
But Riker makes a fascinating, albeit pretty cynical observation here. He argues that modern activists didn't read Hofstadter's piece as a cautionary satire. They read it and essentially used it as an instruction manual.
So to summarize this first pillar of his argument, Riker is claiming that by completely untethering words from objective, biological, or physical reality, institutions are able to enforce total compliance.
Because if violence is defined as whatever the listener feels is violent, then the person who claims to be offended holds absolute unmitigated power over the person speaking.
You can't mount a defense.
Exactly. You cannot mount a defense based on objective facts if the very words you have to use to describe those facts have been engineered in advance to make you guilty by default.
That's wow. So if you successfully untether words from their objective meaning, the next logical domino to fall is how a society determines truth itself.
Right. If language is subjective, reality becomes subjective.
Which transitions us directly into what Riker calls the Schopenhauer protocol and his really aggressive critique of modern epistemology.
Let's define epistemology quickly for the listener. It's the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. How we know what we know and how we distinguish truth from falsehood.
Got it.
Riker sets up a stark binary contrast between two epistemological frameworks. On one side, he places what he explicitly terms masculine logic.
And he anchors this masculine logic in Aristotle, specifically Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction, or the law of identity.
Right. A is A. A thing is what it is, regardless of how anyone feels about it, and regardless of the social consequences of it being true.
And Riker views this Aristotelian logic as the non-negotiable bedrock of physical reality, the scientific method, and basically Western civilization itself.
He does.
So what's on the other side of this binary?
On the other side is what he terms teleological rationalization.
Okay, time out. Let's break that down for the listener who hasn't taken a graduate philosophy seminar recently. Teleological essentially means looking at the end goal or the purpose of something first, right? So what is he actually saying here?
He's arguing that modern, what he calls feminized institutions, have completely abandoned Aristotelian logic and replaced it with a feelings-first ideology.
So the goal dictates the facts.
Exactly. In this framework, the desired political or emotional goal justifies the premise. The logical flow is completely inverted.
How so?
Instead of gathering facts to reach a conclusion, the process goes like this. I strongly want B to be true. Therefore, A must be true to support B. Therefore, I will declare that A is true.
So to put that in a real-world context,
Yeah.
if an activist wants a certain demographic to be viewed as systemically oppressed, that's the desired outcome, that's B, they will retroactively decide that any interaction, any policy, or any statistic, which we'll call A, must inherently be evidence of that oppression. And they will do this regardless of the objective, measurable facts of the situation.
The way Riker analyzes this shift is incredibly clinical. He doesn't just call it bad philosophy or sloppy thinking. He pathologizes it. He claims that our culture has seen the institutionalization of personality disorders.
And he brings receipts to back this up, too. He leans heavily on a couple of recent academic studies. He cites a 2020 study published in the journal Current Psychology and another from 2021 in the Journal of Personality and Individual Differences.
These studies are foundational to his thesis in this section. Riker points to their specific findings, which suggest remarkably strong correlations between high involvement in social justice activism, heavy social media use, and the manifestation of cluster B personality traits.
For those listening, cluster B personality disorders are the dramatic, overly emotional, or unpredictable group. We're talking specifically about narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder.
Yeah, Riker actually maps out the DSM-5 criteria right in the book.
He does a side-by-side comparison, doesn't he?
He does. He looks at the diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. He highlights criterion 1, which is a grandiose sense of self-importance, and criterion 3, the belief that one is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people.
And he compares this directly to the concept of feminist standpoint theory or standpoint epistemology.
Standpoint epistemology being the academic idea that your understanding of the world is entirely dictated by your social identity, and that marginalized identities have a superior access to truth.
Exactly. Riker argues that the idea that only women can truly understand women's experiences, and that any male analysis or objective pushback is inherently invalid, mirrors narcissistic criteria perfectly.
He claims the modern social justice movement acts as a magnet for people who crave unearned moral superiority, and then it provides them with unlimited societal validation by treating their personal subjective grievances as profound political virtues.
This is exactly where he attacks the phrase lived experience. He says this phrase acts as an unfalsifiable trump card in modern discourse.
Unfalsifiable is the key word there. If reality is dictated entirely by an individual's lived experience, you can never ever tell someone they are objectively wrong.
It completely shuts down any capacity for defense or debate.
Completely. Riker argues that if a man tries to point to objective statistics or historical context, or simple logical inconsistencies in a narrative, the new epistemological rules dictate that he is accused of gaslighting or denying someone's reality.
He calls this a distributed delusion. And he compares it to the classic Hans Christian Andersen fable, The Emperor's New Clothes.
In that fable, everyone can plainly see the emperor is naked, but the social cost of stating objective reality is too high, so everyone just pretends to see the invisible clothes.
Right.
Riker says we are living in a society where collective assertion overrides individual objective perception. The cost of dissenting from the agreed-upon emotional delusion is basically social or professional death.
He also introduces a documented psychological phenomenon here to explain why this works so effectively on a societal level. It's called the women are wonderful effect.
This is a widely replicated finding in social psychology. Studies consistently show that both men and women naturally associate more positive attributes like empathy, warmth, and innocence with women than they do with men.
And Riker takes this psychological bias and uses it as an explanatory mechanism.
He does. He argues this bias is why female cruelty, deceit, or manipulation. He gives examples like false accusations, reputational destruction, or parental alienation in family courts is systematically ignored, minimized, or excused by society.
So our inherent psychological programming makes empathy naturally flow toward the cryo woman while demanding stoicism and accountability from the man.
That's his argument, yes.
So if I want to make sure I'm following his logic here, the author is saying that when a corporate HR department brings two employees into a room for conflict resolution, and the mediator asks everyone to center lived experience and prioritize emotional impact over intent, Riker views that as essentially a gentrified Maoist struggle session.
That is a very accurate summary of his view. He argues that in those spaces, you are no longer participating in conflict resolution. You're expected to confess your unearned demographic privilege and affirm the other person's subjective feeling of oppression,
Regardless of the facts.
entirely independent of whatever objective, verifiable evidence might exist regarding the conflict.
But Riker doesn't stop at HR meetings or cultural complaints. If you're listening to this and wondering how this affects the real world, this is where the book takes a really hard pivot. He argues this emotional capture has massive, mathematically quantifiable financial consequences.
He leaves the realm of philosophy and feelings and enters the realm of ledgers and accounting. This section of the book is titled The Reproductive Kleptocracy, and his audit of Western civilization's balance sheet is incredibly grim.
Let's look at his core fiscal argument. It rests entirely on taxation data and the welfare state. Riker makes the claim that over the course of a lifetime, men are overwhelmingly net positive tax contributors.
Meaning, the average man pays significantly more into the state treasury in taxes than he ever consumes in state services, subsidies, or welfare.
Conversely, he claims that when you look at the data for women as an aggregated collective voting bloc, they are net negative tax contributors.
Over a lifetime, they consume more in state-funded services, healthcare, and social safety nets than they contribute in tax revenue.
He builds a very rigid mathematical and historical syllogism around this disparity, focusing heavily on the concept of universal suffrage.
He takes the reader back to the founding of the United States. He points to James Madison's famous warning in Federalist Number 10.
The tyranny of the majority.
Exactly. Madison was deeply concerned about factions. He worried that if a majority voting bloc formed, they could legally use the apparatus of the state to seize the property and wealth of a minority-producing class.
And Riker argues that Madison's exact nightmare scenario was realized the moment the franchise of the right to vote was expanded to everyone without keeping it tethered to property ownership or net tax contribution.
Riker's thesis is that once women gained the vote, they began using the voting booth not just for political representation, but as a mechanism to continuously expand a massive welfare state.
And the function of that welfare state is to systematically redistribute male-generated wealth to themselves.
He calls this emotional taxation without representation.
Which is a hell of a phrase.
It really is.
Yeah.
He uses that phrase because he argues the men who are literally producing the wealth that keeps the system solvent are simultaneously culturally demonized as toxic or oppressive by the very institutions their tax dollars are funding.
To back this up, he tracks the explosive growth of the U.S. welfare state. He notes that in 1960, there were roughly 16 federal welfare programs. Today, there are over 80.
He frames this entire macroeconomic structure as a transfer payment plantation, where men are the designated field hands.
Wow. And he applies this exact same fiscal lens to family law, specifically zeroing in on alimony. And he goes back to linguistics here, discussing the semantic drift of the word alimony.
The historical context he provides is fascinating. The word alimony originally derives from a Latin root meaning nourishment or sustenance.
Right.
Historically, it was intended as a temporary measure to ensure the sustenance of minor children or a truly destitute former spouse. But Riker argues the concept has experienced massive semantic drift.
It's morphed into permanent or long-term spousal support regardless of the presence of children or actual destitution.
He claims it has become a legally sanctioned tool for pure financial extraction.
He describes modern alimony as the state transforming what was supposed to be a voluntary marriage vow into a lifetime, inescapable lien on male labor.
And this leads directly into his macro analysis of demographics and birth rates. If you're looking at the long-term viability of this fiscal system, the numbers are, well, they're alarming. Riker cites the U.S. total fertility rate, which in 2023 was sitting at roughly 1.62 births per woman.
For you listening, demographers agree that a fertility rate of 2.1 is the absolute baseline replacement rate needed just to keep a population stable, let alone grow it. We are far below that.
Riker ties this demographic winter directly back to his fiscal argument. He warns that legacy systems like Social Security, Medicare, and massive sovereign debt are mathematically guaranteed to collapse.
Why?
Because the future tax base, the children who need to be born today to grow up, work, and fund the pensions of the current aging generation, are not arriving.
In his highly provocative phrasing, he says the future tax base is being aborted or contracepted away by a modern culture that instructs women to view motherhood as a form of slavery and corporate careerism as the ultimate liberation. If you're listening and looking at your pay stub, Riker's fiscal argument hits incredibly close to home. I want to synthesize this because it's a huge claim. He's basically arguing that the modern democratic state functions like a subscription service.
A subscription service, yes.
Western civilization is being liquidated to fund a subscription service for female independence from male provision, and men themselves are the product being canceled.
That is a brilliant encapsulation of his fiscal thesis. The state, in his view, functions primarily as an expropriation engine. But here is the critical pivot in the book. Riker notes that in order to execute a wealth transfer of that staggering magnitude, the institutions managing society had to be fundamentally captured and repurposed.
The universities, the courts, the corporations, the media.
Right. They could no longer operate on merit or objective performance or Aristotelian logic because those frameworks wouldn't justify the wealth transfer.
Which pulls us right into chapter 6 of his argument, the institutional long march and what he describes as the systematic purge of male spaces.
Riker outlines a very specific, repeatable 5-stage pattern of institutional capture. He claims this virus has infected almost every legacy institution in the West.
Let's walk through his stages.
Stage 1. The institution is pressured to lower its objective standards of merit in order to increase demographic representation, usually under the banner of diversity or equity.
Okay, stage 2.
Once the new demographic achieves critical mass, they change the institutional culture to prioritize their own cognitive preferences. In Riker's framework, this means replacing objective facts and rigorous debate with emotional safety and consensus.
And then stage 3.
The institution inevitably suffers a catastrophic loss of functional competence because its foundational standards were abandoned.
Stage 4. The public realizes the institution is failing and it loses its legitimacy and authority.
And finally, stage 5. The system collapses, or replacement institutions emerge to fill the vacuum.
Riker doesn't just theorize this. He provides highly specific case studies from the last decade to prove this pattern exists. We mentioned James Damore earlier, the software engineer fired by Google back in 2017.
Riker uses the Damore case as the quintessential example of stages 2 and 3. For those who don't remember, Damore wrote an internal memo attempting to explain gender disparities in tech.
And he didn't use bigotry.
No, he heavily cited peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology and biological differences in interest. He was attempting to use logic, data, and objective analysis.
But Google's institutional culture had already shifted entirely to emotional reasoning.
Damore wasn't fired because his scientific citations were proven mathematically or biologically false. He was fired because the act of sharing that data was deemed harmful to the emotional safety and subjective well-being of female employees.
The institution prioritized feelings over empirical reality.
Exactly. Riker also looks at higher education, contrasting 2 major university scandals from the 2010s to demonstrate the massive asymmetry in how institutions apply justice. He looks at the 2015 Yale Winergate incident and compares it directly to the Columbia University mattress protests.
This is a duck-dating comparison in the text. Let's look at the mechanisms of both. At Yale, a group of male students hung a deeply offensive, crude frat boy banner outside a female student's window.
It was bad behavior.
It was, but the university reacted with overwhelming immediate force, expelling the students within weeks.
Now contrast that with Columbia University. A female student, Emma Sulkovich, carried a mattress around campus for an entire year. She was publicly and explicitly accusing a specific male student of rape.
This was despite the fact that the male student had been cleared by the university's own Title MyX investigation, cleared by local police, and lacked any semblance of due process.
How did Columbia's administration react? They allowed it. They even gave her academic credit for it, framing the public defamation of an innocent student as artistic expression.
Weiger uses this to argue that within captured institutions, female accusations are treated as holy sacraments, requiring absolutely no evidence, while male defenses are treated as heresies requiring no hearing.
He extends his critique to the scientific and medical communities, taking direct aim at the American Psychological Association. He extensively references their 2019 guidelines on psychological practice with boys and men.
He views those APA guidelines as the ultimate proof that even hard sciences have been ideologically captured.
Riker points out that the APA guidelines explicitly pathologize traditional masculinity. The guidelines suggested that traits historically associated with men, like stoicism, competitiveness, risk-taking, and self-reliance, are psychologically harmful and linked to violence and sexism.
And Riker notes the profound, tragic irony here. He argues that the very stoic competitive traits that were absolutely necessary to build, maintain, and defend Western civilization are now being officially diagnosed as mental defects.
Diagnosed by the very people who live in comfort precisely because of that civilization.
Exactly. And this leads directly to his passionate defense of exclusively male spaces. He's talking about organizations like the Boy Scouts before they went co-ed, or fraternities, or even traditional men's clubs. He calls them laboratories of manhood.
Riker asserts that historically these male-only spaces served a vital civilizational function. They were where boys learned competence, hierarchy, discipline, and how to operate and resolve conflict without the influence of female emotional leverage.
He claims these spaces are systematically targeted, sued, and dismantled by feminist activists precisely because they are immune.
A space that operates purely on male hierarchy cannot be manipulated by tears, guilt, or accusations of emotional harm. Therefore, it must be destroyed.
But wait, I want to step in here and play devil's advocate for the listener. I want to push back on Riker's premise for a second.
Sure.
If these institutions, the Ivy League universities, the massive tech corporations, the psychological associations, were originally built by men, as the author heavily emphasizes throughout the book, how does he explain their capitulation?
Right.
Why did these brilliant male architects, CEOs, and scientists just fold? If they had all the power, why did they give it away so easily?
It's the most critical question you can ask, and Riker addresses it directly. He attributes this collapse to a deep-seated psychological vulnerability inherent in men.
A vulnerability.
He argues that men have been socially and perhaps biologically conditioned for centuries to protect women, to provision for them, and to immediately absorb and attempt to alleviate female distress.
The women and children first instinct.
Exactly. So when feminists began marching through the institutions and demanding power, they didn't do it at the point of a sword. They used the language of victimhood, vulnerability, and emotional harm.
And Riker argues that men inherently interpreted this plunder as penance.
They view the demands not as a hostile takeover, but as a cry for help. Riker frames this entire 50-year cultural shift as a civilization-scale shit test.
A colloquial term for a psychological boundaries test.
Women pushed the boundaries of the institutions to see if men would enforce the rules and maintain the structure. And Riker concludes that men fundamentally failed the test.
They failed by apologizing, stepping down, and lowering the gates to alleviate female distress, instead of holding firm to logic, boundaries, and objective standards.
And because men failed that civilizational test, Riker argues we have now arrived at a state of systemic, codified collective punishment.
Which brings us to what is undoubtedly the most controversial, explosive section of the entire book. He titles it Men Camp and introduces his concept of the mirror image doctrine.
The title Men Camp alone tells you how intensely, how catastrophically he views the current cultural landscape. Riker does not see modern feminism as a well-intentioned movement for equality that perhaps went a bit too far or got a little overly zealous.
He sees it as an institutionalized ideology of total demographic demonization.
Yes. Let's unpack this mirror image doctrine. He uses formal syllogistic reasoning again, so it's like a software operating system. Feminism historically claimed to be uninstalling the patriarchy OS, which was characterized by collective guilt and biological determinism.
But Riker is saying they actually kept the exact same malicious code, they just swapped the user profiles. Men are now the default error message.
That's a very precise way to understand it. Riker asks the reader to look at the core tenets of historical patriarchy that early feminism originally rebelled against.
The idea that one sex has inherent, unchangeable traits that justify their subordination.
The idea of strict biological determinism and the concept of collective guilt based simply on your gender. Riker argues that modern feminism has taken that exact same architecture, flipped the target demographic, and instantiated the precise logic it claimed to be fighting.
He says it is misandry codified into a state catechism.
To prove this mechanism in action, he dives deep into the legal system and domestic violence frameworks. He specifically targets something called the Duluth model.
For listeners who don't work in social services or law enforcement, this is huge.
The Duluth model is absolutely central to his argument about how this ideology became law. The model was created by Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar in 1981 in Duluth, Minnesota.
And to this day, it remains the primary dominant framework used by law enforcement, courts, and intervention programs across the West to handle domestic violence.
And Riker attacks the foundational premise of how it was created. He quotes Ellen Pence directly from her own writings, where she admitted that they were actively looking for a political framework to understand domestic violence rather than a purely psychological or empirical one.
So what did they do?
Riker argues they simply took Marxist class struggle theory, opened a word processor, and did a find and replace. They swapped the word capitalists for men and the word workers for women.
And then disguised this political ideology as objective social science.
Exactly. So under the Duluth model, the inherent assumption the state makes is that the man is always the oppressor, using violence to maintain patriarchal control and privilege, and the woman is always the victim reacting to that oppression.
Let's walk through how this works practically. If police are called to a domestic dispute, the Duluth model heavily influences the primary aggressor laws, which often result in the man being arrested regardless of the specific physical evidence.
Riker points out that this completely criminalizes male biology and male existence.
If a man is ordered by a court into a batterer intervention program based on the Duluth model, those programs do not treat an individual behavioral problem, like anger management or substance abuse.
No, they demand the man confess to systemic patriarchal privilege. He must admit his violence stems from a desire to control women as a class.
But Riker doesn't just critique the philosophy of the model. He claims empirical data completely contradicts it, specifically pointing to the 1980 National Family Violence Survey, conducted by researchers Murray Strauss and Richard Gels.
This is a crucial piece of evidence for Riker. Strauss and Gels conducted massive, rigorous, nationally representative surveys on family violence. What they found completely shattered the Duluth narrative.
They found that women initiate physical assault against their partners at equal, or in some specific metrics, even higher rates than men.
They found domestic violence is largely bidirectional, a toxic dynamic between two individuals, not a one-way street of patriarchal control.
And Riker claims this study was ruthlessly, systematically suppressed.
Yes, because that data completely contradicted the Marxist oppressed framework of the Duluth model, Riker argues it was buried.
He details how Strauss and other researchers who dared to cite empirical data showing female violence were professionally targeted, denied funding, and ostracized from the sociological community.
Truth was sacrificed to maintain the ideological narrative.
He also uses the architecture of high-profile false accusations to prove his point about collective guilt. He lists the Rolling Stone UVA fraternity fraud, the story of a student named Jackie that was published as fact and completely unraveled upon basic journalistic scrutiny.
He mentions Crystal Mangum, the false accuser from the Duke lacrosse case who ruined the lives of multiple players, and he extensively analyzes the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation hearings.
In each of these high-profile cases, Riker observes the exact same societal algorithm executing. A sensational accusation is made against a man or a group of men.
The accusation is credulously, immediately amplified by legacy media and institutions because it perfectly fits the pre-existing narrative of male predation.
The men are publicly, professionally, and socially destroyed without a shred of due process.
And finally, when the accusation inevitably collapses under objective scrutiny, there are zero legal or social consequences for the false accuser. The institutions just shrug and move on.
Riker argues this is the exact architecture of a Soviet show trial.
So what does this all mean for the listener? He's saying that by labeling concepts like toxic masculinity as an inherent trait, the ideology strips men of individual moral agency, which he views as a deeply dangerous historical precedent.
If we connect this to the broader arc of history, Riker is sounding a massive, blaring alarm. He says that terms like all men are batterers, or the concept of toxic masculinity are not empirical claims that can be refuted with data.
They are ontological claims. They are claims about what men fundamentally are by their very nature, not what they do as individuals.
When a society declares an entire demographic inherently dangerous, toxic, or oppressive simply by existing, you completely strip them of individual moral agency.
And historically, defining an entire group by inherent, inescapable guilt is the preamble to total disenfranchisement, internment, or much worse.
It's an incredibly dark view of where things are heading. And to explain how a dynamic this destructive could become so deeply ingrained in our culture, he argues we can't just look at the last 50 years of feminist theory.
No, he goes way, way back, past modern history, past what activists call herstory, all the way back to the ancients, to ancient mythology.
The pivot into mythology is fascinating. Riker first tackles the modern concept of herstory and historical revisionism, like the 1619 Project.
He argues these movements are not attempting to provide accurate historical documentation. They are solipsistic narrative replacements.
They attempt to reframe the entire history of human civilization strictly around cycles of oppression and victimhood, completely ignoring the massive, unprecedented leaps in living standards, infrastructure, medicine, and survival that male-led civilization provided to humanity.
But then he says, if you want to understand the actual raw psychology of modern feminism, you shouldn't read modern gender studies textbooks. You have to read ancient myth.
He claims the ancients understood this psychology perfectly, and they tried to warn us.
He points to 4 specific mythological figures to make his case, essentially reading these ancient texts as empirical behavioral observations.
First, he looks at Lilith from ancient Hebrew tradition. The story goes that Lilith was Adam's first wife, but she refused to submit to his leadership. She fled the Garden of Eden and was transformed into a demon mother, historically associated with sudden infant death and harm to children.
And Riker refuses to read this as just Bronze Age superstition. He maps it directly onto modern empirical data.
He claims the myth of Lilith correlates perfectly with the catastrophic negative statistical outcomes we see today for children raised in single-mother households.
Exponentially higher rates of criminal behavior, substance abuse, lower educational attainment, and poverty. He says the ancients empirically observed that rejecting the structure of the nuclear family and male leadership severely harmed children, and they encoded that statistical observation into the myth of a demon mother.
Then he looks at the Greek myth of Persephone, who was abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld.
But the crucial defining detail Riker highlights is that Persephone chose to eat the pomegranate seeds while in the underworld, knowing full well that eating the food of the dead would bind her to Hades permanently.
He sees this as the ancient, perfect template for modern complicity in one's own victimization.
He compares Persephone to people today who loudly claim they are imprisoned and oppressed by the patriarchy while simultaneously eagerly consuming all the resources, safety, technological comforts, and dependencies that bind them to that very system.
He does a similar decoding of Medusa. I found this part absolutely fascinating. Most people think of Medusa as just a monster who turns people to stone, eventually defeated by the male hero Perseus.
But Riker focuses on the Roman poet Ovid's origin story for Medusa, framing it as the original ancient #MeToo template.
In Ovid's telling of the myth, Medusa is a beautiful priestess serving in the temple of the goddess Athena. The sea god Poseidon assaults Medusa inside the temple.
Now look at how Athena, the ultimate female authority figure, responds. She doesn't punish the male perpetrator, Poseidon, who is a powerful god. She punishes the female victim, Medusa.
Athena transforms Medusa into a hideous monster whose very gaze turns men to stone and banishes her.
And Riker connects this to modern institutional behavior. He says this perfectly mirrors the dynamic of modern campus Title IX tribunals or corporate HR departments.
Female administrators, acting as Athena, destroy the lives of male students or employees on mere accusation to protect the reputation of the institution.
They create a monstrous, paranoid environment, turning men to stone, making them afraid to interact or mentor women. Meanwhile, actual powerful predators are often ignored or protected by those same institutions.
It's a profound story of female institutional authority destroying vulnerability and blaming masculinity for the fallout. He also briefly mentions the Celtic goddess Morrigan, a deity of war and fate who appeared as a crow to feed on the carnage of battlefields.
He likens her to the modern outrage industry, the media conglomerates, the activist influencers, the diversity consultants who constantly feed on destroyed reputations, shattered careers, and cultural division.
It's like he's reading ancient Greek, Hebrew, and Celtic mythology as a modern psychological diagnostic manual. He's saying these aren't just spooky stories. They are empirical, cross-cultural observations encoded by our ancestors about what he controversially terms the satanic feminine archetype.
It's a very heavy, inflammatory term. But he explains he means it functionally, not necessarily in a literal supernatural sense.
He views this archetype as a solipsistic, chaotic drive that prioritizes subjective, momentary feeling over objective reality and long-term structure, even if that prioritization leads to total civilizational collapse.
And because Riker believes this archetype has completely, irreversibly corrupted our current legacy systems, his ultimate solution is not reform.
He doesn't think you can vote your way out of this.
No. He believes the institutions are pathologically irredeemable. You cannot reform a system that has abandoned logic. Therefore, his conclusion is total, unapologetic secession.
This brings us to the climax of the manifesto, Chapter 15, the logocentric restoration, and Chapter 16, the thousand-year masculine dawn.
This is where he outlines the actionable core of the book, the Schopenhauer Protocol. Riker insists that men must wake up to the reality that they cannot argue with emotional chaos using logic alone.
Logic will not persuade an institution that is emotionally captured. Logic only serves to shield your own mind from the gaslighting.
In a rigged game, the only winning move is to stop playing. Men must withdraw their consent, their labor, their tax dollars, and their intellectual resources from captured legacy institutions.
They must build what he calls the New Jerusalem, or high-tech feudalism. And he isn't just speaking theoretically here. He gives incredibly actionable, step-by-step examples for how this parallel society is already being built right now.
Let's start with the most important part, the money. Financial secession via Bitcoin and cryptocurrency.
Explain the mechanism here. Why does crypto matter in a cultural war?
Riker views cryptography as the ultimate impenetrable defense against the gynocentric state. Why? Let's look at how the modern state exercises power.
The feminist welfare state funds itself through three main avenues: fiat inflation, taxation, and family court asset transfers.
All three of these mechanisms require a centralized banking system where a judge or an administrator can simply order your bank to freeze your assets or garnish your wages.
Gitcoin changes the physics of money. A blockchain is entirely indifferent to tears, outrage, or court orders.
A smart contract executes based purely on code and mathematics, not on someone's lived experience or emotional testimony. Riker points out a beautiful reality for his thesis. You cannot complain to a corporate HR department to reverse a Bitcoin transaction.
You cannot shame a decentralized network into complying with a political agenda. Crypto removes the fundamental vulnerability to emotional pressure campaigns and state seizure.
He points out that this theory was actually proven a few years ago. Between 2017 and 2019, centralized platforms like Patreon, PayPal, and Stripe were mass deplatforming creators for wrongthink.
He specifically mentions the Honey Badgers podcast. They were a men's rights group that was banned from Patreon because activists complained. But they survived and actually thrived by transitioning entirely to crypto donations.
It was the absolute proof of concept that parallel, censorship-resistant financial systems work.
He extends this exact same logic to media secession. Instead of begging captured legacy media conglomerates for a voice or trying to reform the New York Times, men simply bypassed them and built parallel platforms.
He notes the incredible success of Substack, pointing out that it generated over $300 million for independent writers in 2023.
These are writers, thinkers, and journalists who bypassed the HR gatekeepers completely and went directly to their audience. He also heavily emphasizes educational secession.
If the universities and public schools are captured by stage 4 institutional rot, what's the solution? Riker points to the massive explosion in homeschooling.
He cites data showing homeschooling rates in the U.S. jumped 63% between 2020 and 2023.
Right, because during the pandemic lockdowns, the curtain was pulled back. Parents looked at the Zoom screens and saw exactly what was being taught to their children: gender ideology, critical theories, and what Riker explicitly calls female supremacism, disguised under the benign label of social-emotional learning.
Instead of going to school board meetings and petitioning for reform, which Riker views as a pathetic waste of energy, parents just pulled their kids out. They withdrew their consent and their funding.
He also points to higher education alternatives being built from scratch, like the University of Austin, which he says prioritize objective truth and rigorous debate over accreditation from a corrupted, dying legacy system.
He even touches on the most biological aspect of society: reproduction. He highlights the pronatalist faction in Silicon Valley, specifically mentioning tech billionaires like Elon Musk, who has utilized unconventional, technologically assisted methods to have many children outside the traditional family structure.
Riker sees this as the ultimate civilizational bypass. He claims that technically sophisticated, high-net-worth men are quietly funding the research and development necessary to completely decouple reproduction from what he calls the empowered dater, whose fertility window has cratered.
He says artificial wombs, surrogacy networks, and advanced reproductive tech will completely crash the economic and biological monopoly of the traditional dating and family court markets.
When you zoom out and combine all these elements, cryptographic, decentralized money, independent and uncensorable media, decentralized homeschooling networks, and alternative reproductive technologies, Riker predicts a very specific, inevitable cultural extinction.
He says the Karen archetype is mathematically doomed.
The Karen archetype, the internet meme of the entitled woman demanding to speak to the manager.
Exactly. Riker analyzes the Karen not as a meme, but as a power dynamic. Her entire social power derives from her ability to summon institutional force.
She needs a manager, a police officer, a university administrator, or an HR department to arrive and punish the person who violated her emotional sensibilities.
But think about Riker's parallel society. If the institutions themselves are entirely bypassed by decentralized network states, if interactions are governed by automated enforcement and cryptographic smart contracts, there is no manager to call.
There is no HR department to complain to. She is, as Riker so vividly puts it, a mammal calling out in a digital ocean that does not possess the receivers to recognize her frequency. Her power is reduced to zero.
That is a wild, incredibly evocative image. He is casting a vision of a 1,000-year masculine dawn. He sees a future composed of a network of technologically advanced sovereign city-states and digital polities.
These parallel societies will be governed entirely by competence, pure logic, code, and physical capability, completely insulated from the emotional chaos and the draining taxation of the longhouse of legacy Western society.
It is a radical, uncompromising vision of exit over voice. He doesn't want a seat at the table. He wants to build a new table in a different dimension.
He believes the men who actually make civilization function, the engineers, the builders, the logisticians, are quietly going on strike from the old world and building a new one in the digital and physical interstices of the decaying empire.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. To quickly recap this intense intellectual journey, End of Gynocentrism takes us from the quiet, insidious manipulation of dictionary definitions and the weaponization of our language through the complete replacement of objective Aristotelian logic with personality-disordered emotional reasoning.
It audits the grim fiscal realities of male tax contributions versus the expanding welfare state, analyzes the hostile systemic takeover of male institutions, and decodes ancient mythological figures like Medusa and Lilith as urgent warnings from our ancestors against female solipsism.
Finally, it advocates for a total, unapologetic, technologically enabled withdrawal from modern Western institutions into cryptographic, parallel societies governed by pure competence.
It is a sweeping, highly structured, and deeply challenging architectural argument. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final question, to ponder something that builds on Riker's thesis, but wasn't explicitly resolved in the text we reviewed.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Riker's vision of high-tech feudalism actually comes to pass, and a technologically advanced, decentralized, logocentric parallel society manages to fully detach its wealth and intellect from the legacy democratic welfare state, what happens when these two completely incompatible worlds inevitably collide over physical reality?
They still have to share a planet.
Exactly. What happens with the dispute isn't over words or HR policies, but over physical resources like arable land, energy grids, and water infrastructure. Can a digital secession ever truly permanently escape physical geography?
That is a heavy, incredibly provocative thought to chew on. Can you ever really untether from the physical ground you stand on, no matter how good your cryptography is?
It's the ultimate question.
We want to remind you, once again, to please like and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss one of these deep, comprehensive breakdowns. Today we reviewed the provocative, newly released 2026 ebook, End of Gynocentrism by Conrad Riker.
If you want to explore these arguments, check the data, and trace the syllogisms for yourself, you can buy the book right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And if you want to follow the author's ongoing real-time analysis of the culture, you can find him at Conrad Riker at his Substack. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive.
Until next time, keep questioning the premises of the world around you.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.